Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out so early. So the talk really quickly, hope for team defense. It's going to allow me to mispronounce defense a whole bunch of times for you guys, but that's because I'm South African, I'm allowed. I want to say thank you, firstly, for coming out before 10 a.m., and thanks to 44Con for inviting me. Keynotes are weird. On the one hand, it's an incredible honor. I always feel really good when invited. On the other hand, it's a solid reminder that you're getting old and probably less relevant. For you guys, keynotes are supposed to hopefully get you thinking, and so I'll say some stuff that might make you a little bit angry, but that's kind of the point. And it's funny because yesterday as I landed, this link was going around Twitter about why keynotes are generally train wrecks and why they suck. And so what I did is I changed a whole bunch of my talk, and instead what I'm going to do for the most part is try to give you guys links to other smarter people. So if there's anything you don't like, you can just blame them. But in seriousness, for the most part, I want to use the talk to point you to a few links, to a few talks that you guys should have been picking up on. And if not for that, just to show you a whole bunch of geographically sensitive Danbo pictures. And if we're talking Danbo pictures, almost the subtext of this talk or the alternate title would be come over to the blue side, where I'm trying to convince a whole bunch of people that they should be moving over to the blue team. I'm not sure if Mr. K and Steve made it out here this early in the morning. Thank you very much. I had a long talk with them that we'll get into later today. But before we get there, I figure it makes sense to do a quick recap. So previously on ranty keynotes given. In 2011, I did a talk called Fig Leaf Security, where I essentially said we were hiding behind fig leaves a lot. Like we had a lot of things that we hid behind for convenience. And the crux of what I was saying was that generally we were sucking, and generally it was our fault for sucking. And lots of people hated it, and a few people hated me. And then I spoke at 44Con, and coming off of about 11 years of doing penetration testing, I spoke about how I think penetration testing isn't really helping anymore. Because largely I was saying more and more people are doing it, and we're not being appreciably more secure. And then people really hated me. Okay, and lots of my friends had lots of arguments with me about it. But for the most part, the guy that I agreed with was Brian Snow, who back in 2011 said, your cyber systems continue to function and serve not due to the expertise of your staff, but just due to the sufferance of your opponents. And it's always uncomfortable to hear this, especially nowadays when we've got stable jobs and we're getting paid well and we're traveling to conferences and stuff like that. But in 2011, it was a hard argument to make, and today it's a lot less hard an argument to make, okay? Because for one thing, LulzSec went around and used 1999 hacks and owned the planet, and then Snowden showed us that the intelligence agencies were hacking the rest of the planet, and nobody knew it was happening, okay? And when I spoke at Black Hat Europe last year, I said that things are actually going to get worse for a while. Okay, and I break it down into 3 reasons why I think things are going to get worse. Essentially, I say there's the Snowden effect, where people, well, first there's the Assange effect, right? And the Assange effect, I'm saying, Assange used to always say courage is contagious. As a few people leak, more people will get courage and more people will leak. And my argument with the Assange effect is I'm not sure if that will happen regarding courage, but I am sure that more people are aware of the value of information. And so people who are now secretaries working for a big bank figure out that actually there's value in their corporate email. And in truth, we're not prepared for those things. And we saw a whole bunch of this happen with the Mossack Fonseca stuff, and I think it's going to get worse. With Snowden, whether you think what he did is right or whether you think what he did is wrong, one of the things he did was bring hacking to the common zeitgeist. It came off into the popular press. And so now real bad guys are looking around going, hey, we can make money off this stuff. We can get some geek to go into that company and we can actually do real stuff with it. And the last reason why I think things are going to get worse is because of complexity. Okay, without saying the words IoT, complexity everywhere is spinning out of scale. And the examples I gave back then, if you have a Mac and you use one of these video adapters, you cut them open and you find out it's got 2 gigs of RAM and a system on a chip. So your video adapter is a computer. And modern hard drives are a computer. You can run Linux, or that guy ran Linux on the hard drive. And Bunny and Zobs, now almost 3 years ago, did a talk where they literally circumvented the processors on those 20-cent SD cards. Okay, so there's complexity everywhere. In Europe, I also spoke about our monitors having x86 computers in them. And if you guys were watching, you'd have seen at the last Black Hat, Ang Q, whose mission in life appears to be to make us distrust every office peripheral we have, has now written code so that your monitors can do bad stuff. And that stuff's not going anywhere. The complexity still exists. And if you want to hear all of those dangerous things that should be keeping us up at night, the talk that I gave at Troopers called The Hard Thing About Hard Things will cover some of that. But just because there's lots of hard things, one of the things that you've seen happen is lots of security guys go all the way into security nihilism, right? So there's a general feeling of, well, we can't protect anything, let's just break stuff, okay? Hi again to Steve and Mr. K. Because there's a general feeling that says, look, it's all broken, we might as well have fun, we might as well do stuff. And in terms of this it's all broken, it's all owned thing, probably the best response is just, well, that's just your opinion, man. And you're starting to see signs of the tide turning. And for one part, I want this stuff to actually come away from the talk. One of the interesting signs of this would have come up recently if you guys were paying attention. It was hard to miss with the whole Apple San Bernardino case. And something really interesting happened with this case, right? Whether or not the FBI were eventually able to decrypt this phone, you're starting to see signs of one of the fundamental laws that we've held till now breaking down. So if you're in security long enough, at some point you quoted this TechNet article, which was around 2000, where Microsoft had the 10 fundamental laws of security. And what's interesting here was Law 3, right, which said that if a bad guy had unlimited physical access to your computer, it wasn't your computer anymore. And what's so interesting about the San Bernardino case is you're starting to see signs that on completely off-the-shelf commercial hardware, you can start to get to a point where it's secure enough. Now, it's not currently, and everyone has an opinion on how Secure Enclave can be made better, but we're starting to get close, right? And it's completely commodity hardware. And Apple are super interesting for this stuff. I'm not sure how many of you saw Ivan Kristik's talk at Black Hat this year, but it was fascinating because the lengths that Apple are now going to try to convince you that you should trust them, even for things like storing your password manager in the cloud, are starting to border on ridiculous. So how many of you have seen that talk? Anyone with a show of hands? Okay, about 10, maybe. It's super interesting. It's available on YouTube. You should go check it out. But the first part that's interesting is the design goals they started with. They set themselves some insane, lofty goals. Part of it being Apple shouldn't be privy to any of your secrets. You should be able to trust that an evil Apple can't do anything. And some of the stuff that they got to try to make this happen, they ended up inventing or using these architectures where they have a whole bunch of hosts tied to HSMs working in concert. And then they've got processes where people come in by committee and store keys in proof evidence bags. And at the end of it, they literally blend those security cards. So literally, even if Apple want to do bad stuff to you, for certain parts of the design, they can't. Now, like I say, it's interesting, not just because they're destroying smart cards, but because they're actually taking the time to do security architecture right. Okay, and you're starting to get to the point where really smart people can inspect the design and say, yes, well, we don't see a way for this to be easily bypassed. And you're starting to see signs not just from Apple, right? Even if you look at guys like Microsoft and the mitigation bounties that they're putting out, Microsoft will currently give you around $200,000 for new mitigation bypasses. The guys at Google Project Zero did another super interesting talk. If you get a chance, go and watch Ben Hawk's talk at Enigma last year. The talk was called What Makes Software Exploitation Hard, but that's almost the smallest part of the talk. What the talk's super interesting for looking at is seeing a really smart exploiter look at exploitation from first principles. Okay, so they're looking at things and saying, well, how far can fuzzing get you? If you fuzz it for long enough, do you manage to take the bugs out? So if you see guys talking about, are bugs sparse or aren't they? Project Zero is actually doing the science to try to figure that stuff out. And the slide that they were talking about there was seeing an increase in the price of Adobe 0 days just because of the work that one researcher effectively was doing. If you guys have ever seen Natalie talk about Tamagotchi security, she's just about found every bug in Adobe Flash for the last while. But it's interesting. But with all these rays of hope, enterprise security still sucks pretty badly. Okay, and that's because on your average enterprise, according to Mandiant, according to Microsoft, hackers will live for about anywhere between 170 and 200 days before being discovered. And so most companies don't know when they owned. Most companies are buying tech that don't really matter. You see lots and lots of people saying, maybe we can't do this thing right at all. If you've ever watched Alex Stamos give a talk, so he gave a talk at AppSec USA a little while back, and sorry for the quality of this slide, but he spoke about, like for his proof, he said, look, most enterprises are not safe, and he spoke about the Fortune 500, and he split them into the secure 100, and he wasn't saying these guys are not breakable, he was saying these guys know how to play the security game. He said these 100 guys can probably play security, figure out how to do incident response. And he called these other guys the toasted 400, okay? And by extension, unless your org is in that top 500, I'm guessing you sit under that toasted 400, okay? So if you're trying to figure out where you sit, well, to make it easy, this is number 500 on the Fortune 500, and their market value is around $28 billion. Okay, so if Alex is saying that these guys are part of the toasted 400, you need to start doing some pondering about where your company fits in this hierarchy of able to do it versus toasted. And this puts us in a very sad place. Okay, and again, it doesn't quite make sense because I said this talk would be hopeful, and I said that hopefully we'd be optimistic. And so I'll tell you, I am going to be optimistic, and later on, I'm even going to try to give us a silver bullet. Although most people insist that there isn't one for security, I'm going to try to, hopefully we leave here today with one thing that I think can drastically improve your security. So before we get there, some quick questions. A, why are we failing? And B, is anyone succeeding? And the simple question for why we can't secure companies is there's lots of reasons. Okay, and it would be pretty insulting for me to stand up here and say we're going to cover all of them. But one of the reasons is that there's so many reasons. Okay, and so one of the hard parts of security these days is just figuring out which reasons are worth chasing. And one of the things that I've been harping on for a little while is that we spend a lot of time these days doing stuff that doesn't fundamentally move the needle, okay? And lots of that stuff has become locked into our own best practices that just don't make sense anymore. And some of them we're starting to cotton on to, so thank God people are figuring out that rotating passwords every 30 days or 15 days doesn't help anyone. But I submit that there's other stuff like that that needs thinking about, like patching servers. I know entire security teams that dedicate dozens of people just to patch servers. And it's starting to look like that's a fight that maybe we don't have to fight to do what we want to do. And some of it needs some different thinking. So we're not going to go into a whole bunch of those. Instead, I'm going to focus on one thing. And the one thing that I want to focus on is this. For most enterprises, we need to realize that generic solutions fail, okay? A long time ago, I spoke about, or I tweeted about the fact that FireEye, that was supposed to be protecting us from zero-day, was itself vulnerable to zero-day, which probably meant that we needed another box to protect us from our FireEyes. But it does point to a very clear problem. And Dino tweeted and often talks about this, that we need to understand that this concept of putting highly privileged code in front of stuff to protect us probably isn't that smart. And if you want to figure it out, probably the easiest thing you can do is just follow Taviso, who's just been taking the AVs to shreds for the last while. But it's not just semantic, right? If anyone went through the Veracode report a little while back, you would have seen that security software comes second only to CMS software in terms of how bad our security is. Okay, so if anyone remembers, FX said by this logic, you'd be better off protecting your network with Microsoft Word than a checkpoint firewall. But jokes aside, even if the security vendors started doing stuff better, the fundamental problem you have is one that the very smart Dan Gear and crew figured out when they spoke about the dangers of a software monoculture. And that is that your defense is known, okay? Any attacker worth his salt is able to buy your antivirus or buy your FireEye and work on it long enough to figure out how he can bypass it. Which led Alex Stamos to say, when he was at Yahoo, that all of these generic solutions were useless. And he went out and said, look, we used to have lots of FireEye, and now we're ripping all of the FireEye out. And I'm not here just to pick on FireEye. I've got nothing personal against them. It's just that, as Alex said, your opponent would have to be an idiot if he cared enough about breaking into your network and he didn't also buy FireEye to get his stuff through it before going ahead. And it leads me to my contrarian opinion for the morning, which is that good defense is a series of internal hacks. Okay, and this sounds wrong. And there's a few things that have changed, both IT-wise and security-wise. Because for the longest time, we were told not to go for quick hacks, right? When people studying at universities would go through boring sections of whether you build internally or whether you buy and how those equations are done. Okay, and quick hacks were always frowned upon. If you were doing something in the enterprise, it needed to have a SLA and it needed to come in a shiny box. But what we're figuring out for security is that things move too fast. Okay, and you're starting to see very clear signs that this is one of the reasons why offense does so well. Okay, for anyone who trolled through the NSA leaks, the Snowden NSA leaks, one of the things you should find interesting is with lots of the infrastructure that they built for mass ownage, you'd look at it and go, that's not sustainable. You're building sniffers that sit on massive network points and sniff based on tags that you see coming through. It's trivially wrong, right? We can give that sniffer more work to do than we have to do work to keep it busy. If you just send it random tags, they've got to start decrypting random tags. But it was good enough for them, and so they used it, and they used it successfully because they owned the planet and none of us knew it was happening. But they didn't super optimize for, is this SLAable? They did what they needed, and they did it as long as they could. And I'm saying defense needs to start doing more of that. Okay solutions that work today are better than the perfect solutions that will maybe come into place and work tomorrow. And I want to hit some quick examples for this. How many of you here, with a quick show of hands, how many of you here work in offense, so pen testing, red teaming, any of that? Okay, so a good number of you. How many of you have done a pen test in the last year or two and not gotten domain admin? That's even better than I thought, so that's almost no one, or you're shy to say that you didn't get domain admin. Like, if you want an internal network, you're going to get domain admin, right? Again, talking to the guys yesterday, and just about everyone knows they're talented owners. They talk about how they get domain admin every time they go out. How many of you detect when a new user is added to domain admin on your company network? Like it's stupid WMI or PowerShell that you could write with no admin privileges. Like every 5 minutes, enumerate your domain admin group and tell you when a new user is added to it. And I can tell you from having done way too many pen tests, nobody figured, like we would hand in the report and talk about how we got domain admin, and the guy would tell us about how hard they work, and we'd have to point out that we still domain admin on their network, okay? Or you're still in the backup group that's actually got domain admin privileges. And it's a stupid, stupid hack, but it would at least let them know before 200 days are up that someone's got domain admin on their network. Just like that, there's a whole bunch of them. This is not me shilling. We give away Canary tokens free. But the whole point of Canary tokens are little things that you can do on your network to let you know when bad stuff is happening. If you guys are interested in this, you should check out Azhar and Nick talking later today on this stuff, because it's interesting. Zane Lackey gave a talk a whole 3 or 4 years ago on defense guided by offense. And he pointed out that if you look at who runs ipconfig, ifconfig, uname, or whoami on your network, you're almost always likely to find an attacker. There's very few times that this would run on your network and actually belong to a valid user. And so again, all they do on their network is watch for when these things are executed, and when they're executed, it's a red flag that badness has happened. And again, the cynic in us is going to scream, but what about false positives? And the answer is, what about false positives? Sure, occasionally you'll find it's on a dev's machine, and you'll go, cool, that's the dev machine. Or you'll check, and he'll be fine with it. But it's no reason to not do these things. And they're small things that'll actually matter. And for this stuff, there's kind of just one small thing that stops us from doing this. And again, if you go back to the security textbooks, everyone talks about people, process, and technology, and any vendor screams it the moment you talk to them. And I'm saying we should start forgetting about that triad and start being honest that it's just people, okay? Because if you've got the right people, they'll make the technology work, and they'll make the right processes that you need. But all the technology in the world and all the process in the world won't help you if your people are crap. Okay, so you're going to need to get good people. So to figure out how to hit this, I sent a note to the 44Con organizers to find out what our split in the room was. And our split is essentially some security management folk, some guys on defense, and some guys on offense. And so hopefully we'll come up with something for everyone. So for security management, I'm going to start off with quoting Parisa from Google. And she said this a few years ago, and it leads to an interesting thought, right? And so essentially she's saying, everyone going to RSA, don't buy anything, go hire good engineers, and then actually listen to them. But you bump into a fundamental problem here, and that is that most organizations will happily pay millions of dollars for equipment, right? Those FireEye boxes that I was talking about don't come cheap, but somehow organizations manage to buy them. Okay, you just don't see those organizations willing to pay really good security people that much money to keep them. Okay, and what you bump into here is, a long time ago, Paul Graham wrote this about great hackers, great builders. And he was talking about the difference between really good hackers and average hackers. And he said a really good hacker will transform your company. He'll 10x the value in your company. And he said, fortunately, you don't have to pay him 10 times the salary of the other developers. Like, he'd be happy with just paying him double. But nobody does this, right? Because the concept is completely foreign to us. And if you're a manager, if you're a security manager, what I'm saying is, if you recognize that your org will happily pay millions for FireEye, but not millions for staff, then if you went back today and fixed that, you would have done more for security than almost anything else you could do for your organization. Okay, go back and fix this thing that lets us actually pay for really good guys. And the question then has to come up, because like Ian pointed out, almost everybody is recruiting. How many of these expensive, good people do you actually need? The question came up, interestingly, on Twitter recently when Andrew Case said something, and he was complaining about the guys at Slack. And he said, well, when they have an org that's as big as Google or as big as the others, then I'll know that they're secure. And Ryan Huber responded beautifully by saying, absolutely, headcount is absolutely the best metric for a security team. And Ryan knows what he's talking about, right? Because if you haven't, you should check out, he's got a talk on security automation at Slack. Okay, how they manage to scale security reasonably enough with a reasonably small team. And essentially, Ryan was quoting an older sage, which is the guy who made 300. Because if you remember the movie 300, you remember the scene where they meet, and the Athenians say, look, we've committed more men to battle than you have. And Leonidas stands there in his red underwear, and he essentially says, well, look, what do you do? And the guy says he's a potter and he's a builder, and then he points out that all his guys are warriors. Okay, and the crux of it being, you're better off having 300 Spartans than you are having 3,000 Athenians who just happen to do battle in their spare time. If you're getting really good guys, you don't need tons of them. You can go pretty far with a few good guys who are empowered. So that's enough for security management. Next, I want to talk to the guys on the blue teams. And if you're doing defense right now, there's a whole bunch of good examples coming out from companies that are doing stuff differently and doing stuff nicely. So I already spoke about the stuff that Ryan's doing at Slack, but there's good examples coming from Facebook, from Etsy, from Square, from Uber, from Airbnb. And I'm going to whiz through some of them really quickly. If you're watching the Facebook guys, you would have seen they released OS Query, okay, which is a tool that's now spun out into its own company, but essentially a way for you to track your Linux and Mac boxes. You'll see the guys from Airbnb have moved this so you can run it all in the cloud smoothly. When they were at Square, or when he was at Square, I'm going to butcher his name, Diogo Monica, gave a talk. How many of you have seen this talk? Exfiltration-resistant infrastructure at Square. Okay, I see one hand. And something you must notice here, when I ask these questions about how many of you have seen this talk, the hands are disproportional. If I had to ask, like, how many of you saw this talk on how to build extrusion-resistant infrastructure versus how many of you saw the talk where Mark Dowd popped an iPhone using AirDrop? Okay, I'm not throwing stones or anything, but I think that's something you guys need to think about. So these guys did this talk about their security architecture at Square and how they can build the infrastructure to make sure that even if they're compromised, data doesn't leave the network in any readable way. It's worth watching, and it raises a point that's interesting that I want to touch on in a bit. The other talk that's interesting also at this conference was from John Flynn, who gave a talk on how they implemented two-factor authentication at Facebook. Again, quickly, how many of you have struggled to implement two-factor authentication at your company? Okay, there's a couple hands going up. Does that mean the rest of you have got it licked or given up hope? Okay, we'll figure that one later. What's interesting is you should go watch this talk about what they did to implement two-factor authentication at Facebook. Because they essentially jumped through a whole bunch of hoops, including submitting and writing patches for SSH, so that they could get the logging that they needed to make the stuff work. And the last example I want to give here is on Google Beyond Corp. Beyond Corp is super interesting. A few years back, there were guys talking about the Jericho network, where your network had no perimeters, and the Jericho network stuff didn't really go anywhere. But Google's implemented huge parts of this. Google Beyond Corp now means that if you're sitting on Google's internal network, or if you're sitting at a Starbucks, it makes no difference to Google infrastructure. Okay, and they're starting to talk more about it now. And what I want you to question is what you notice about all these companies. Okay, what you should notice is that security is not taking the traditional role of telling people what they can and can't do on the network. Okay, instead, security at all of these places is listening to Balmer and focusing heavily on developers. Okay, all of these guys are essentially using development to start getting security to fit in. Sorry, I just have to try to fit this video in at least once every 4 years. But there's an interesting point here. When Stamos spoke about the 100 and the toasted 400, the way he categorized the 400, the thing that he said they were missing was the ability to do secure software engineering and engineering-focused incident response. He said they were in the bottom 400 because they didn't have the ability to create instead of buy solutions. And in his talk at that point, he said that because of their size, Yahoo needed to build their own tools. But I'm saying it's not a size question. Like, you need to be building your own tools if you're doing security, or else you're not going to be able to get anywhere. And this is not just me, right? Mark Andreessen, a long time ago now, spoke about software eating the world, right? And you see it in everything. And the simple reason for that is because software is a massive force multiplier, right? If a few guys can build value in an Instagram worth a few squillions, it's because they're using software as a multiplier. And it's something that we need to start figuring out. The Facebook guys gave a talk at some point about how they do mobile security. How many engineers do you think work on mobile security for Facebook? So I can tell you, I wouldn't have guessed, but Subodh Iyengar gave a talk on it, and he pointed out that they have 3 security engineers. Okay, and he then spoke about what they do, and he said they don't spend all of their time auditing other people's code. What they do is build secure libraries and secure tools that the rest of the company can then make use of. Okay, and you're starting to see that stuff come through more and more. You're starting to see security not being the box checking you guys did wrong, more the guys that actually build stuff that enables the business. And Rich Smith did a few talks talking about the security culture at Etsy. And he was pretty straightforward about it, saying, as a security team, your value is in what you enable, not in what you block. And he pointed out something interesting. He said, if your security engineers just want to block stuff, they're just giving the easy answer. What you want are the guys who look forward to that hard problem of making solutions that actually work. And in security, we've kind of gotten to this point where we kind of feel we could tackle any obstacle course that's out there as long as there were no obstacles on it, right? So we could totally do two-factor authentication at our company if those stupid users would just adopt two-factor authentication. Like all of these things would work if only the other people cooperated, and we act as if they're doing something wrong, okay? When in actual fact, that's the problem we're getting paid to solve, finding a way to make that stuff work even with the people there. So again, Rich talks about impact and using finite amount of no's. But something I want to point out here is we've gotten into a bad habit of thinking that people who can break stuff, people who can think like attackers, just raise issues all the time, but we've almost stopped prioritizing these issues. And in all of those examples of guys who are building security infrastructure, you'll see them come out with points where they'll tell you, yes, we know this part is not secure, but we're trying to compensate for it with this, or yes, we know this is not secure, but it's more secure than not having any of it at all. And I mentioned the Facebook talk, which really, if you guys get a chance, you should go check it out. But something that's interesting is there's a point in the talk where John says they implemented two-factor authentication, and they went ahead and they used Duo and they used Yubico, and they got to a version of their solution. And he essentially says, so they were using event push notifications, okay? So if you use Duo, that's what it is. So you try to authenticate, you get a push on your phone. And then he stops and he says, but listen, we've got 6,000 developers, and every time these guys want to push code, we can't have them taking out their phone from their pockets to look at whether their code is right or wrong. And so he goes, we have to find a way to do better. And that's not something we say often enough when we're in security. Like literally we go to, we've given you a secure token, why don't you use the secure token? And what they did was they ended up building a two-factor authentication system that's actually quicker than not using two-factor authentication. So developers now choose to use 2FA, not because they want to be secure, but because it's quicker and less friction than the alternative. Okay, and essentially that's where we have to go. But what you'll notice is a difference in that guys like John have turned the game around in terms of what they want out of their job. Okay, if you listen to him talking in that talk, he essentially says what he wants is to create frictionless security for his team or for his company, and that's what he's spending his time doing. If you look at the stuff that guys like Diogo and Nate are doing, in this instance, they've taken huge parts of Square infrastructure. When you hit Square infrastructure, you're now hitting code that these guys have written, okay, as central parts of the chain. And in security, it's something that we've been avoiding for a long time. Again, with some of the guys that I spoke to yesterday, we're really happy to throw stones, but we don't want to be the ones maybe getting called out at 3 in the morning because our code is now breaking. And I think we've gotten away with that for a long time, and I don't think we're going to be able to get away with it for much longer. We're going to have to put stuff front and center, and it's going to have to be the way. So lastly, I want to talk quickly about the red teamers. And again, like I said, my subtext here was that you should come over to Team Blue because it's going to be fun. And essentially, one of the central questions you have when you're blue teaming is, can you own this thing? Okay? And what's interesting is most of us got into this game for the intellectual curiosity of it. Okay, we wanted to know if we could own stuff. We wanted to know, we took progressively harder challenges. Can you own it? Can you persist on it? Can you infiltrate from it? And if you've been doing this for more than a year, one of the things that you should have figured by now is that that's just not that hard anymore, okay? You may occasionally get a hard target, but for the most part, you can answer that question before you get out of bed. If you're an embedded red team with a company, you can almost answer that question today for the next 3 years going forward. Okay, because it's an easy one to answer. Can you exfiltrate? Can you embed? Can you own stuff? And yesterday I spoke to two of my friends who've been owning stuff for years. Like, they gifted at owning stuff. They know they can. And something that's interesting is one of the comments that come out of this is the consistent one that says that, look, you know everything's broken. Why would we bother trying to fix it? And what I'm saying here is most of us got into this game because we thought we were clever, right? The reason we originally said we wanted to work on the red teams were because we said there were hard problems that we wanted to solve. And what I'm saying now is that these hard problems are still there, but the hard problems are on the blue side. Okay, so the question is not, can you break into this network? Because chances are the answer is yes. The question is, if your monitors suddenly turned evil because of AngQ, could you detect it? If we can't protect everything that the CEO is doing, can we at least know when he's getting owned? Can we build our production infrastructure in a way that we can wipe and bring it back up again in 2 minutes or in n amount of time so that we can deny people persistence? If you look at Apple, the questions that they're answering, can we build an infrastructure that holds people's secrets, that is protected even from us? Okay, there's tons and tons of really good questions, really fun questions. And literally, these are all just beautiful problems to work on. I quoted it before, but there's a really nice poem called The Man Watching, which talks about, the way it ends, it talks about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and it says, winning doesn't tempt that man. This is how he grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. And essentially, for us, this is the place we should be aiming at now. Not owning the same stuff that we were owning for the last 5 years because we can, but figuring out a way to maybe stop us on our best day, or at least for now, detect us on our best day. So in summary, our old way clearly wasn't working. For the most part, enterprise security is an engineering problem. We need to start looking at it that way. As always, we can't outsource our thinking, so we're not going to be able to buy a box with blinking lights that solve stuff for us. We're going to have to start engineering our way out of it. And for the most part, good things happen when you hire smart people, so that's probably where we should start. Other than that, I think I'm just about done, so you guys can scream at me on Twitter, or I suspect I've got time for questions.